The morning air smelled of damp wool and polished brass. A single trumpet note, thin and trembling, cut across the square and dropped like a coin into a well of murmurs. He stood at the curb, coat buttoned wrong, hat worn in the way only someone who had once stood at parades and then stopped standing could wear. He was 83 years old, shoulders bent from years of carrying unseen burdens, eyes that had the distant clarity of someone who remembered maps and faces in the same breath. A young officer stepped forward, badge bright enough to flash light into the old man's pupils. "Sir, you cannot pass," the officer said, voice practiced, a blade wrapped in protocol. The old man did not answer at once. He kept his hands folded over a small metal object pressed beneath his palm, as if the warmth there anchored him. Around them, the plaza hummed with black coats and muted cameras. A woman in a navy suit fumbled with her program. A boy on his father's shoulders craned to see. A city worker named Paul Turner wiped rain from his brow and watched with a hardening jaw. The officer repeated, "This area is restricted," as if the square had teeth to bite anybody who did not belong. Behind the velvet rope, the flag over the casket drooped like a promise waiting to be kept. The first small crack in the morning was the officer asking for identification and the old man tapping his chest, quiet as a clock. The crowd leaned in. The old man did not shout. He did not plead. He simply lifted his hand a fraction, revealing a dented compass on a thin cord, its glass cloudy from years of sea salt and sun. A seam of silence ran through the assembled people. It was the kind of silence that smelled faintly of gun oil and tea and the light in which stories begin. When someone reached to touch the compass, the air in the plaza seemed to tilt. This was not only the story of an old man turned away. This was a question about who remembers, who honors, and how an institution treats its own when memory is the only proof. The tension moved like a wave. The officer grew firmer. "You will have to leave the closed area," he said, louder, eyes darting between the cordon and the mourners. "This is a private ceremony for family and invited officers." The old man blinked slowly. A neighbor, Ana Delgado, whispered to her companion Nurse Maria Ortiz, "He does not look like trouble." Captain Elena Ruiz, who had been part of the organizing detail, stepped forward and asked for the old man's name. He answered in a voice that carried the same flat cadence of radio transmissions, "Thomas Avery." Someone in the crowd, James Monroe, the archivist from the Veterans Registry, felt his stomach tighten. A young reporter, Kayla Singh, lifted her camera higher, sensing the human angle. The friction between ceremony and exclusion. A retired sergeant, Tom Bradley, shoved through politely and placed his hand on the officer's sleeve. "Give him a minute," he said. The officer glanced at the list taped to his clipboard, the names printed like commandments. "I am following protocol," he said, but his voice betrayed the strain of an order that had not been tested against a face like this. "Protocol," echoed Mayor Linda Park to herself as she watched from under an umbrella. The old man did not protest. He lifted the compass, turned it so that the dent caught the light. Someone in the crowd recognized an inscription, tiny and worn, and a ripple passed through the plaza like a breeze over dry leaves. "It cannot be," muttered Reverend Samuel Cole, who had presided at more funerals than anyone else in the city, and who now clutched his raincoat with shaking fingers. The scene felt like a verdict waiting for its evidence. Pause for a moment of pause. We know this moment stirs anger or curiosity. If this moved you, consider telling us about someone you think deserved recognition and did not receive it. Share a short memory that starts with the phrase, "Oh, my hero," and then a single sentence about what they did. Your memory could help someone else feel seen. Your comment might lead to the next story we tell about honor left waiting. Many people in this crowd had stories tucked into their pockets. They wanted to speak. They wanted to honor. Tell us who you remember and why, and use the phrase, "Oh, my hero," to begin. We read every comment. We collect names. Some of these comments become letters that we hand to officials at city halls and parades. Your voice matters because institutions change when communities speak. Now let us return to the square where a small compass held in a tremulous hand began to make people remember. The officer gestured for a security aide to look through a list. An argument began, polite and sharp, like instruments tuned against each other. "We have families inside," said Captain Ruiz, her breath visible in the cold air. "We have a schedule." "He has a right to be here," Tom said, "if he is who he says he is." The officer's voice hardened. "Verification first." Ana Delgado stepped forward and said, "He is not here to protest. He is here to pay respects." A man named Benjamin Cole, grandson of a soldier fallen in the same conflict, murmured, "If he is a veteran, we owe him a seat at least in back." The officer folded the clipboard, mimicking authority, and repeated the rule. The old man lowered his eyes. He began to tell, in soft sentences, pieces of a life that sounded like an old radio log. "We were ashore near a small cove," he said. "A storm came in faster than the maps said it would. I carried him across rocks that cut like glass." Each phrase seemed to press on an old bruise in the air. The crowd shifted, sensing the shape of something larger. The officer paused. His throat worked. The trumpet note sounded again, now faint, like memory itself calling people back to attention. No one moved to push the old man aside. The question hung between the ropes and the mourners. Did protocol mean turning away the person who had once saved the very life now lying under the flag? A small metal circle, the compass, became an argument and a relic. It had an inscription almost erased by time. Initials, a date, a name. When Kayla Singh leaned in to photograph it, the lens caught not only the object, but the way the old man's fingers kept it close to his sternum, as if to keep his past from blowing away. "Why was I turned away?" the old man asked eventually. And the question was not only for the officer. It was a pebble thrown into an institutional pond. The reaction was immediate and personal. People called out suggestions. Someone reached for a phone. Archivist James Monroe said he would check records. Nurse Maria Ortiz said she could confirm service wounds from a scar that matched a medical file. Reverend Samuel Cole crossed himself and told the officer, "This is more than a rule. This is about the rituals we owe each other." For a moment the square felt ancient, like a church full of voices that remembered all the ceremonies once taken for granted. The officer's face, trained to be unreadable, betrayed the small human question. What do you do when the list says no, but the living presence seems like proof enough? A call was made to the base. Fingers on a phone dialed names in a controlled panic. "This man claims to be Thomas Avery," said Captain Ruiz into her headset. "He is asking to pay respects." In an office down the street, General Martin Hayes, whose portrait hung in the hall, sat with the funeral order in front of him. The call landed on his aide, Lieutenant Clark. "Sir, there is an elderly man at the gate insisting he was connected to the general," Clark reported. In the chapel, family members arranged programs and tried to keep tears like small coins in a hand. The phone conversation became a ripple that found another ripple. Mayor Linda Park, who had fought to keep the ceremony dignified, received a terse update. "Verify identity," came the instruction. But there was something in Lieutenant Clark's voice, a quiet note, that made the mayor pause. She remembered a letter, yellowed and folded, that the general had once kept in his desk and that he had shown her in a coffee shop years ago. The letter's name was Thomas. The mayor felt the weight of memory and protocol pressing at once. She asked to see the old man herself. For the first time since the plaza had filled with mourners, the bureaucratic and the personal touched at the edge. A decision had to be made about what respect looked like when a proof came in a dented compass rather than a stamp on a document. The arrival of authority changed the tempo. Lieutenant Clark stepped into the drizzle and into the halo of umbrellas, his shoes wet, his collar stiff. He looked at Thomas Avery and asked for his story in a tone that mixed the mechanical and the curious. They began to speak in front of the crowd and tape recorders and soft shoes. "Tell me the name of the operation," asked Clark. "Tell me the name of the cove and the captain you served under," said Captain Ruiz. Thomas cleared his throat, and his voice carried the rasp of salt and age. He said a name that was not on any public list now, a name that brought a pause to the lips of people who had been waiting for the general to be remembered properly. "We were under the command of a man called Ridley," he said. "We moved at night with 3 small boats. The tide took one. I dragged one man, then another. I thought the sea had taken us all." The exchanges lengthened into a sequence of questions and answers, each line adding a layer of verification and of humanity. Kayla's camera clicked. Tom Bradley nodded, as if aligning memory with law. Reverend Cole murmured a prayer that sounded like an old operation code. The crowd watched as formal inquiry and lived memory negotiated the old man's right to stand where the flag covered a person once saved by him. This was the moment when an institutional transmission collided with a memory that smelled of diesel and tea. Lieutenant Clark made calls that moved up a chain. He spoke to a man named Harold Pierce in the archive, who confirmed a partial roster mention, then to a nurse named Maria Ortiz, who recalled treating a leg wound with a scar pattern matching Thomas's. The chain reached out like fingers through decades. Then the call reached Captain Hayes, the general's younger brother, who had been in the family receiving room. He asked, "Does the name Thomas Avery mean anything?" Someone handed him a program, and he ran a thumb over a photograph of a young man in uniform. Something tightened in his throat. He remembered a story his brother told over a cheap cup of coffee once, in which he spoke of a compass and a promise. The thin chain of small confirmations grew into a rope. People in the crowd began to speak by name. Benjamin Cole said, "My grandfather talked about a man who refused a medal." Anna Delgado said, "My uncle served with a Thomas who always kept a compass." Archivist James Monroe found a faded entry that matched the date on the compass. Each voice gave the old man a kind of community witness. Protocol could be paused by enough people telling the same true story. When the general's car drew up, the plaza chemistry shifted, like the change in air before a storm breaks or a long-held breath lets go. A tall figure in civilian coat stepped out with a folded face. General Martin Hayes walked slowly, the funeral weight in his steps, and yet when he saw Thomas Avery at the cordon, his face altered. There was a hitch that was not grief alone. The general moved forward, soldiers making room, as if memory itself had given him permission. Thomas, who had kept his silence like an old radio operator kept his station, straightened as if the world had tilted back into place. The general came close enough for their shoulders to almost touch. He cupped the compass, surprising the old man with the gentleness of someone who had 1,000 funerals to command and yet shows a private gesture. "You should be inside," the general said softly, and the voice, usually a boom, was small enough to carry the history of nights on the sea. "You were with me when the current tried to take everything. You pulled me clear." The crowd exhaled like someone who had been holding their breath too long. The officer at the rope removed his cap and stepped back, his posture reorganizing around a new command. Captain Ruiz wiped her eyes. Kayla lowered her camera, letting the moment be rather than only capture it. Reverend Samuel Cole stepped forward and said a few words that were half prayer and half acknowledgement. "Honor will not be kept by forms alone," he said. The moment reconfigured itself into something like restitution. What followed was more than a handshake. The general, without speaking to the press, signaled his staff. Lieutenant Clark ran to fetch a spare badge, and a family liaison stepped forward to escort Thomas into the hall. The procession made room for someone who had been invisible to lists but visible to history. The old man's feet made slow prints on the red carpet, as if each step recorded a ledger entry of its own. Inside, the funeral shifted tone from ceremonial distance to an intimate accounting. The general paused by the casket as Thomas approached. The taped microphones hummed, but something tender and private passed between these men. The general spoke low so that only a few could hear. "You kept me when the sea wanted to forget us," he said. Thomas nodded. There was a flash of an old photograph pressed into a wallet, a younger version of the general with a compass like that, sunburned faces and brittle smiles. The crowd felt the reversal. The city had almost lost the man who had saved the life now memorialized. An apology moved through the organizers, quiet and earnest. Mayor Linda Park, who understood the political weight of such gestures, walked up and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, saying, "We must do better." Her words were not only personal, they were a prelude to action. The revelation opened like a layered map. The compass had once been issued to a small search party in a mission whose records had been scattered between files and fog. Flashbacks arrived in sensory bursts. The first flash held the taste of salt on the lips, the sting of wind in the face, the grinding sound of surf on rock. Thomas remembered the smell of rusted metal and the smell of a man's jacket soaked through with the sea. He remembered hands that were young and then older by the time dawn came. The second flash was of sound, of orders barked over the roar of waves, the creak of a hull, the small voice of a commander telling him to go back twice because someone had called his name. The compass had slipped from the general's pocket into Thomas's at the moment when the general's life flowed through him like an open wire. The third flash was touch. Thomas felt again the weight of the general being lain across his shoulder, the cut of rope against his palms, the coarse texture of the seaweed that clung to uniforms. These scenes were not long, but they were dense, each image a stone with a whole map etched into it. Witnesses described the smell of cordite and burnt rope, the feel of numb fingers, the sight of a light that had winked as if saying good night to the shore. In quick successive images, the crowd saw not only the later retirement in medals, but a raw act of human salvage that had been recorded in memory rather than in ceremony. The backstory that followed came in 3 short paragraphs that held a lifetime. He had grown up in a coastal town where people learned to read currents the way others read calendars. He had signed up young, more to belong than to be brave. In formation, he learned to keep his head when others lost theirs. One winter storm had taught him the cost of small choices. He had trained under Captain Ridley, a man who liked the sound of names and the smell of coffee in the morning, and who once told Thomas, "You always know where to find the way home." Years later, loss had been steady. He buried a brother, and he watched friends disappear into reports that filed no names. He returned to quiet life and kept a compass in his breast pocket, not as proof, but as memory. When the general was swept away years after that winter, Thomas found himself acting not from courage, but from everything habit had stacked inside him. He carried the general, bandaged a leg with his own shirt, and never told the story because names like that belonged to the living who had time to speak them. The backstory connected to the conflict now because Thomas had never sought recognition, and the institution had no record except in the edges of memory. This lack of paper nearly meant an erasure. The compass was a brittle witness that refused to lie. The public revelation brought rapid institutional response. Lieutenant Clark convened a meeting in the chapel with Captain Ruiz, Archivist James Monroe, Mayor Linda Park, and Reverend Samuel Cole. They decided to amend the guest verification process to include community witness statements, emergency corroboration steps, and a temporary grace period for veterans to prove identity by non-traditional means. The city announced a review of old rosters and an initiative to digitize records that had rotted in basements. A training seminar was scheduled for all security officers about recognizing veteran signs and human approach. Captain Ruiz admitted later that the policy had been too rigid and that she would oversee a new empathy protocol. General Hayes, in a public remark later that afternoon, acknowledged the failure to recognize those who served without certificates, and said the institution owed a debt not only to the fallen, but to those who kept the fallen alive. The change was immediate but humble. The officer who had first denied Thomas was reassigned temporarily to administrative duties and enrolled in the new program to learn how to ask and to listen. Mayor Park promised a Memorial Day investigation into missing records. These were not grand gestures. They were procedural stitches to close an institutional wound. For Thomas, the restitution mattered more in small things: a seat at the ceremony, a private space to speak to the family, a written apology that he read with a face that reddened like someone who had not been used to receiving letters. The public speech that crystallized the moment happened at the graveside when General Hayes stepped to the microphone and set aside his prepared text. The wind picked up, and the flags moved like breathing things. He spoke of debt and memory, and of the simple, stubborn acts that form the moral backbone of a community. He acknowledged Thomas by name and told the crowd about a night when the sea nearly had him. He described a dented compass, a hand that would not leave, and a young man who learned to be steady. The speech used few grand words, and instead held images that landed like stones. "We are a nation of lists," the general said, "but also a nation of hands that reach when lists are not enough." He called for a new registry review and invited families to bring stories. After the speech, there was a silence so full it seemed to repair something. Kayla Singh recorded the applause, but what the cameras kept was the way Thomas bowed his head and how Reverend Cole placed a palm on his shoulder like a benediction. There were tears, some wiped away, and then the ritual continued, but different now because the mourning had become also a moment of recognition. In the weeks that followed, the threads of restitution became actions. 1 month later, there was a quiet ceremony at the Veterans Archive where a new plaque was unveiled listing names that had been found in marginal notes. Thomas was there, small and steady. Archivist James Monroe read aloud the entries that finally matched the dented compass, and there was a collective inhalation like a city finding its breath. Nurse Maria Ortiz organized a meet and greet at the Veterans Clinic for those whose service files were incomplete, offering medical screenings and a help desk for paperwork. Young reporter Kayla Singh published a feature that put Thomas on the front page, not as a curiosity, but as a subject of quiet heroism. 2 months later, the security training rolled out across municipal and national venues. 10 sessions taught by Captain Ruiz and Reverend Cole together, blending procedure with compassion. General Hayes personally signed a memorandum to fund digitization of old rosters and to set a community hotline to verify veterans in extraordinary circumstances. 6 months from that rain-soaked morning, the city dedicated a small bench in the park near the chapel with a simple inscription about those who keep others alive. Thomas went to sit on that bench once, twice, then often, taking a thermos of coffee and speaking to neighbors who stopped and listened. His life did not change into a parade of honors. It changed by degrees. Letters arrived from people whose relatives had been lost in other files and who now found their names again. The institutional changes were not perfection, but they were a visible tilt toward remembering better. There were other consequences, too. Captain Ruiz kept a small photo of Thomas at her desk, a reminder of the moment where procedure met person. The officer who had first enforced the cordon, who later took the empathy training, volunteered at a local veterans center, learning to fold paper cranes for younger visitors and listening to stories over tea. Mayor Linda Park created a task force that included veterans, archivists, clergy, and community members to ensure that policy listened as much as it enforced. Kayla Singh continued to tell stories of overlooked service, and more than one reader sent in a photograph of a dented object found in a drawer, asking how to proceed. Reverend Samuel Cole led a series of community circles where people shared service memories and where the word honor was used like a small lantern carried among them. The city paid a modest stipend to families whose records were found and had them included in the official memorial list. None of it erased the past neglect. It did, however, turn attention into measurable change. In quiet moments, Thomas sat on his bench and coaxed pigeons from crumbs, listening to conversations about policies as if they were waves coming in. He spoke to the general once more in private, not for ceremony, but for the twin reason of 2 people who had been through a night together. "You could have left me," he said with a small smile, "and I would have forgiven you." The general looked at him and said, "You never gave me that choice." They each knew what had been given and taken. Sometimes Thomas would open the compass and let the light fall across its glass and talk to no one about a map only he remembered. He sometimes visited the veterans clinic and sat in the waiting room where strangers told him their names, and sometimes the names matched the ledger and sometimes they did not. He kept the apology letter folded in his breast pocket next to the compass, reading it when rain surprised him or when a young soldier passed by and nodded in a way that said, "We know." Months later, he received a small ceremony of his own at the archive, where community members he had never known stood to speak. Ana Delgado read a short piece about domestic sacrifice. Nurse Maria Ortiz read a medical note confirming scars that matched his. Paul Turner from the city maintenance crew spoke about the dignity of small gestures. And Benjamin Cole read a letter from a family whose life had been altered by a recognition that came late. The city had changed its policies, but more than that, it had altered a habit of mind that once practiced ignoring the lived things that do not fit neatly on a list. The final thought that the city seemed to rehearse was this: institutions are collections of rules and paper, but they are also promises we make to each other about how to be human. When those promises fray, someone like Thomas holds a small compass and reminds us that memory, not only form, is a kind of proof. If this story leaves you with one thing, let it be the small lesson that a single object can carry a life, and that a single act of listening can change procedure into mercy. If these stories touch you and you want to see more where communities reclaim honor together, subscribe and join us. We tell the stories that nudge institutions and that ask communities to remember aloud. The greatest uniform is the dignity someone carries silently.